Pour a glass of water and hold it for a moment before you drink it. What you are holding is the most pharmacologically active substance in your body, not a vehicle for other things, not a solvent that passively dissolves what matters, but an active participant in chemistry so fundamental that removing it does not slow down your biology. It stops it entirely. Not gradually. Immediately. The enzymes in your cells that catalyze every chemical reaction your body performs require water not merely to do their work but to exist in a functional form at all. The proteins that build tissue, carry oxygen, fight infection, transmit neural signals, and replicate DNA are held in their precise three-dimensional shapes by water. Remove the water and the shapes collapse. The shapes are the function. No shape, no function. No function, no life. The reason every doctor tells you to drink more water is not the reason they give you, and the reason they give you, the generic instruction that water keeps you hydrated and flushes toxins and helps your kidneys, is not wrong so much as it is almost entirely beside the point. The real reason is molecular. It is structural. And it operates at a level of physical chemistry that most clinical training does not reach. Let me start with the protein. Every protein in your body, every enzyme, every antibody, every hormone receptor, every structural molecule in muscle or bone or blood, is a chain of amino acids that folds into a specific three-dimensional shape. The shape is everything. A protein that does not fold correctly is, biologically speaking, not that protein at all. It is biologically inert or worse, actively toxic as in the prion diseases, where misfolded proteins aggregate and destroy neural tissue. The folded shape of a protein is determined partly by the sequence of amino acids, the primary structure, but the relationship between primary structure and final folded shape is not simple or direct. The folding process depends critically on the molecular environment in which the protein finds itself. And the dominant feature of that molecular environment, in every cell of every living organism, is water. Water is not inert in the presence of proteins. It is structurally active. The water molecules adjacent to a protein surface do not behave like bulk water. They form an organized shell called the hydration shell, in which the water molecules adopt preferred orientations determined by the specific chemical groups on the protein surface. Hydrophilic groups, polar and charged amino acid side chains, attract water molecules, which orient their partial negative charges, the oxygen end of the dipole, toward positively charged groups and their partial positive charges, the hydrogen ends, toward negatively charged groups. Hydrophobic groups, nonpolar side chains like leucine, valine, and phenylalanine, repel water, forcing the surrounding water molecules to form a clathrate-like cage structure that is entropically costly. The protein minimizes this energetic penalty by folding the hydrophobic groups away from the water, burying them in the protein's interior. This is the hydrophobic effect, the dominant driving force for protein folding, and it is entirely a consequence of the behavior of water around nonpolar surfaces. This was established through decades of physical chemistry, beginning with the work of Walter Kosman at Princeton University, whose 1959 paper in Advances in Protein Chemistry titled, "Some Factors in the Interpretation of Protein Denaturation," is the foundational text for understanding the thermodynamic basis of protein folding. Kosman showed, through careful analysis of the thermodynamics of hydrophobic transfer, the energy cost of moving a nonpolar molecule from a nonpolar environment into water, that the driving force for burying hydrophobic residues in protein interiors is primarily entropic. Water molecules constrained around hydrophobic surfaces lose orientational freedom, increasing the free energy of the system. Folding buries these surfaces, releases the constrained water, and gains entropy. The protein folds because doing so is thermodynamically favorable, and the thermodynamic favorability is created entirely by water's behavior around hydrophobic surfaces. When you are dehydrated, when the water content of your cells falls even slightly below optimal, this thermodynamic balance shifts. The hydration shells around proteins are thin. The entropic driving force for maintaining the buried hydrophobic core weakens slightly relative to competing factors. Proteins that are marginally stable at full hydration, and a significant fraction of cellular proteins operate very close to their stability threshold, begin to show increased fluctuations in their folded structure. Some partially unfold. Some aggregate with each other. The enzymes whose catalytic activity depends on maintaining a precise active site geometry lose precision. This is not a dramatic or sudden collapse. It is a gradual erosion of functional fidelity across thousands of different protein species simultaneously, producing effects that show up in cognitive performance, muscular endurance, cardiovascular efficiency, renal function, and immune response, not because any of these systems specifically needs more water, but because all of them run on proteins, and all those proteins need water to maintain the shapes that constitute their function. A 2% decrease in body water content, the threshold at which most people begin to feel thirsty, produces measurable impairment in cognitive performance. Not severe impairment. Not dramatic. Measurable. Adrenarine Marquez and colleagues at the University of Connecticut Human Performance Laboratory documented a 2% dehydration-induced decrease in cognitive performance, including impaired attention, reduced working memory capacity, and increased reaction time, in young adult women in a study published in the Journal of Nutrition in 2012. A separate study in young men by the same group found similar effects, with the additional finding that the cognitive impairment occurred even in subjects who did not report feeling thirsty, suggesting that the threshold for physiological effect is below the threshold for subjective awareness of dehydration. The body's cognitive function is degrading before the person knows they are thirsty. The mechanism is not primarily that the brain lacks water directly. The brain is approximately 73% water by mass and is exquisitely sensitive to changes in osmolarity, the concentration of dissolved particles in extracellular fluid. A 2% reduction in body water increases plasma osmolarity by approximately 5 to 10 milliosmoles per liter, an amount small enough to be unmeasured by most clinical instruments but large enough to activate the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, trigger antidiuretic hormone ADH, release from the posterior pituitary, and initiate a renal water conservation response. But the relevant pathway for cognitive effects is different. When the extracellular fluid becomes even slightly hyperosmolar, water moves by osmosis from the intracellular compartment into the extracellular space, causing cell shrinkage. In neurons, which are particularly sensitive to volume changes because their function depends on maintaining precise membrane geometry and neurotransmitter concentration gradients, even small volume reductions alter the geometry of synaptic terminals, reduce the distance across the synaptic cleft, and change the diffusion kinetics of neurotransmitters. The synapse becomes physically slightly different from what it was at full hydration. The signal is slightly different. Not dramatically. Slightly. But slightly, in a neuron, is the difference between firing and not firing, between the threshold being crossed and the threshold being missed. And here is where the story changes because the mechanism I have just described, protein stability, hydration shells, synaptic geometry, is the physical chemistry layer. Beneath it is a layer that operates at even finer resolution, the role of water in enzymatic catalysis. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze chemical reactions. They speed them up by factors of a million to a quadrillion compared to the uncatalyzed rate. The way they do this is by binding their substrate, the molecule to be reacted, in an active site, a precisely shaped pocket in the enzyme surface, and then stabilizing the transition state of the reaction, the high-energy, fleeting configuration of atoms that exists between reactants and products and that the reaction must pass through. Stabilizing the transition state lowers the activation energy, which is the thermodynamic barrier the reaction must cross, and this is what makes the reaction go millions of times faster. The precision of transition state stabilization depends on the precision of the active site geometry, which depends on the folded structure of the enzyme, which depends, as we have established, on water. But water also participates directly in enzymatic catalysis, not merely as a structural support. For a large class of enzymes, hydrolases, which include proteases, lipases, and nucleases, water is itself a reactant. The hydrolase uses water to cleave chemical bonds. A protease uses water to break peptide bonds between amino acids. A lipase uses water to cleave fatty acid esters. A nuclease uses water to cleave nucleic acid backbones. Every one of these reactions requires a water molecule to be delivered, at precisely the right orientation and position, into the enzyme's active site. The enzyme does not simply speed up a reaction that would happen anyway. For hydrolases, the reaction would not happen at any biologically relevant rate without water as a co-substrate. Water is not the medium in which the reaction occurs. Water is one of the molecules being reacted. Beyond hydrolases, water participates in enzymatic catalysis through the proton relay networks that many enzymes use to shuttle protons, hydrogen ions, through their active sites as part of the catalytic mechanism. Serine proteases, a large and important class of enzymes that includes the digestive enzymes trypsin, chymotrypsin, and elastase, as well as the coagulation cascade enzymes that form blood clots, use a catalytic triad of amino acids, serine, histidine, and aspartate, connected by a proton relay network that requires precisely positioned water molecules at specific points in the relay chain. The water molecules are not incidental to the mechanism. They are structural elements of the catalytic machinery, occupying specific positions in the active site crystal structure that have been mapped by X-ray crystallography. Remove water, or reduce water activity through dehydration, and the proton relay chains in these enzymes malfunction. The enzymes slow down. Not to zero, but measurably, in proportion to the degree of dehydration. Now I want to think about the kidney because the kidney is the organ most commonly mentioned in the context of hydration, and it is worth understanding precisely what the kidney is doing with water and why the conventional explanation, that water helps the kidneys flush toxins, is so much less interesting than what is actually happening. The kidney filters approximately 180 liters of blood plasma per day through the glomeruli, the microscopic filtration units in which blood pressure forces plasma across a semi-permeable membrane, leaving blood cells and proteins behind while passing water, electrolytes, glucose, urea, creatinine, and other small molecules into the filtrate. Of the 180 liters of filtrate produced, approximately 178.5 liters are reabsorbed by the tubular system of the nephron, leaving approximately 1.5 liters to be excreted as urine. The tubular reabsorption of water is driven by osmotic gradients. The renal medulla is maintained at extremely high osmolarity, up to 1,200 milliosmoles per liter, compared to plasma's 285 milliosmoles per liter, by the active transport of sodium chloride by the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, using the enzyme NACATPase. Water follows the osmotic gradient passively through aquaporin channels, water-specific channels discovered by Peter Agra at Johns Hopkins University, work for which he received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2003. The critical point that the flush toxins explanation misses is that the kidney's ability to concentrate urine, to excrete waste while conserving water, is directly limited by the osmolarity of the medullary gradient it can establish. If the kidney is asked to excrete a large waste load, after a high-protein meal for instance, which generates a large urea load, or after strenuous exercise, which generates creatinine and other metabolic waste, and the body's water supply is insufficient to dilute the filtrate before excretion, the tubular epithelial cells lining the collecting duct are exposed to very high concentrations of these solutes. Some of these solutes, uric acid, calcium oxalate, can crystallize when their concentration exceeds their solubility threshold. Kidney stones are not primarily a failure of the kidney. They are primarily a failure of dilution. The kidney functions correctly, concentrating the filtrate as instructed, but the concentrates exceed the solubility of their components and crystals nucleate. Adequate hydration prevents this not by making the kidney work better but by preventing the concentration from reaching the crystallization threshold. The kidney was working correctly all along. The water was keeping the chemistry above the danger line. But there is a mechanism operating in the kidney that is even less well known, and it involves the role of water in maintaining the architecture of the nephron tubule itself. The tubular cells of the nephron, particularly the proximal tubule cells, which reabsorb the majority of the filtrate, are among the most metabolically active cells in the body, consuming oxygen at a rate comparable to the heart muscle. They require this energy to power the NACATPase pumps that drive tubular reabsorption, and they are supplied by the peritubular capillaries, which deliver oxygen from the blood after it has passed through the glomerulus. These capillaries are sensitive to hydration status. In dehydration, as blood volume falls and blood viscosity rises, peritubular capillary perfusion decreases. The tubular cells, already operating at near maximum metabolic rate, begin to experience relative hypoxia, oxygen delivery falling below oxygen demand. This triggers a response involving hypoxia-inducible factor 1-alpha, HIF-1-alpha, a transcription factor that under hypoxic conditions shifts cellular metabolism toward anaerobic glycolysis and initiates a cascade of gene expression changes that, if sustained, promotes tubular cell injury and eventually tubular atrophy. The structural scaffold of the nephron, not the filtration function, not the concentration function, but the physical architecture of the tubule, is being maintained by adequate blood volume delivery to the peritubular capillaries, which depends on hydration status. Chronic mild dehydration sustained over years does not produce acute kidney injury. It produces gradual architectural erosion of the renal tubule, detectable on biopsy but invisible on blood tests until late in the process. Richard Johnson at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Carlos Roncal Jimenez at the same institution published a review in the American Journal of Nephrology in 2015 arguing, with supporting animal data, that chronic mild dehydration activates the fructose vasopressin uric acid pathway in the kidney, a metabolic cascade in which vasopressin, the antidiuretic hormone released during dehydration, activates fructokinase in tubular cells, producing intracellular uric acid, which activates inflammatory pathways and promotes tubulointerstitial injury. In animal models, chronic dehydration equivalent to what many humans maintain as a baseline, drinking enough to avoid thirst but not enough to maintain adequate urine dilution, produced measurable tubulointerstitial fibrosis over months. The disease mechanism was not stone formation, not acute injury, not sudden failure. It was slow inflammatory erosion driven by the vasopressin signal that the body uses to conserve water. The body's own dehydration response pathway was damaging the organ it was trying to protect. This is the reason every doctor tells you to drink more water. Not because the instruction is imprecise. Because it is, in the context of a clinical encounter, the most efficient prescription for a problem whose full mechanistic explanation would require approximately the amount of time this has taken. The instruction is correct. The explanation behind it is molecular, structural, thermodynamic, electrochemical, and architectural, and it begins not with the kidney, not with the blood, but with the water molecules arranged in precise orientational patterns around the hydrophobic residues buried inside every protein in every cell of your body, doing the work that has to be done for any of the rest of this to be possible at all. Here is the part of this story I find worth dwelling on. Linus Pauling, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1954 for his work on the nature of the chemical bond, and a second Nobel Prize, Peace, in 1962, the only person to win 2 unshared Nobels, was one of the first scientists to take seriously the structural relationship between water and biological molecules. His 1951 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences establishing the alpha helix and beta sheet as the fundamental secondary structural elements of proteins described, for the first time, the hydrogen bonding patterns that stabilize these structures. What Pauling identified, and what has been confirmed and elaborated by 7 decades of structural biology since, is that the same physical chemistry that makes water a remarkable solvent makes it the indispensable architectural partner of every biological macromolecule. The hydrogen bond, the relatively weak, direction-specific interaction between the partially positive hydrogen of one molecule and the partially negative electronegative atom, oxygen or nitrogen, of another, is the physical basis of both water's unusual properties and the secondary structure of proteins and nucleic acids. The alpha helix exists because of hydrogen bonds between carbonyl oxygens and amide hydrogens in the peptide backbone. The double helix of DNA exists because of hydrogen bonds between the bases of complementary strands. Water forms hydrogen bonds with itself, which is why it has an anomalously high boiling point, high surface tension, and high specific heat. Life invented its structural language from the same physical vocabulary as the molecule it is dissolving in. This is not a coincidence in the trivial sense. It is a consequence of the fact that life evolved in water, using water, selecting molecular structures whose properties were compatible with aqueous chemistry over 3.8 billion years. Every protein fold, every nucleic acid structure, every membrane lipid bilayer, every enzyme active site is what it is because those configurations were stable and functional in the presence of water. The architecture of biology is water-shaped. The proteins that constitute you were designed, by evolution, by natural selection, by 3.8 billion years of trial and error in an aqueous medium, to require water for their function. The requirement is not incidental. It is structural. It is foundational. It is written into the shapes. So when you hold that glass of water before drinking it, what you are holding is not a supplement or a maintenance fluid or a toxin flusher. You are holding the molecular environment in which the entire architecture of your biology was built, tested, refined, and optimized over a timescale that is difficult to comprehend. The proteins in your cells are waiting for it. Not in a metaphorical sense. In a thermodynamic sense. In a structural sense. In the precise and literal sense that they cannot maintain their shapes. The shapes on which every function you have depends, without the water molecules that organize around their surfaces and drive the hydrophobic effect that holds them together. Drink the water. Not because the doctor said so. Because your proteins are waiting for it.